even the Jesus story, his biography, is completely unoriginal. All the gods that came before him had like the same birthday.
And the same story, though, as well.
Same story, the same, yes, disciples, like 12 people. Many of them were
The
crucified
Sumerians
on
had
some
the same Jesus effect.
Yeah, they took the stories that were going around the Mediterranean at the time.
Hey friends, it's Abdu Murray with another episode of All Rise, a podcast where we look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective, and you get to be the jury. Well, one objection that we're going to address today is the objection that Christianity is an amalgamation of different pagan myths that either predated Christianity, that influenced it in terms of the life of Jesus. That, Jesus, like many other religions, was a mythical, dying and rising God who had 12 disciples, just like other gods in other religions, and that he was born on December 25th, just like other gods in other religions, and that he dies, but then he rises again and is going to come again in judgment, just like in other religions. This is a claim that has been made for decades, actually. Now, the legal issue we're going to be tackling here is part of a series of videos we've talked about called Asked and Answered. Now, an objection you raise during a trial would be asked and answered, or during a deposition, you might say, objection, I object to that question because it's been asked and answered. Now, if you've seen previous episodes where we've talked about the asked and answered objection, you can, fast forward a few seconds. But if you haven't, here's a brief explanation. In a deposition or during a trial, when a witness is on the stand or a witness is giving testimony, a lawyer may ask that person some questions. And oftentimes, the lawyer might not like the exact answer the witness happened to give. Either it wasn't worded in a way that was terribly favorable to the lawyer or his case, or it was something that the lawyer knows the guy is trying not to admit. So I'll keep asking him the question until he finally admits it, and I'll give it in a slightly different form. And there's some leeway given here, but oftentimes, if it goes on too far, the lawyer for the witness, if he's paying attention or she's paying attention, will say, objection asked and answered. And sometimes it'll be sustained. That objection will be sustained because what you can't have is a trial that's bloated with a bunch of questions that have already been asked over and over again numerous times. Just because the lawyer asking the question doesn't like the answer doesn't mean the lawyer gets to keep on asking the question over and over again, hoping to fatigue the witness so that the witness might admit something that he or she might not have wanted to admit or might actually not be true or whatever it might be. So we want to make sure that we don't bloat our trials or our proceedings with those kind of things. Well, this objection that Christianity has borrowed from pagan myths and pagan mythology is essentially the same question that's been asked and been raised for decades, yet for some reason it's still around. So it's been asked and it's been answered, and it's been answered conclusively. Now, during the course of this episode, there have been some sort of nuanced ways in which people have raised the objection again. In other words, they've walked back what they've said in terms of other pagan myths parallel the Christian story, but they've kind of kept going with that line of thinking. They just sort of rephrased the question or rephrased the objection. So we're going to object. It's been asked and answered, and I'm going to give you the answer so you can see conclusively that it has been answered. But we are going to address the sort of the nuanced ways in which the objection has been raised once again, only to find out really in the end, it's the same question, slightly different, and they're hoping to get a different response. But the problem is the response is still the same because the truth is still the same. Now, the people who tend to actually raise these objections in our sort of most modern iterations of these things or the most recent iterations of these things tend to be people who have large platforms. I'm thinking of someone like Bill Maher, for example. And I'm going to play a clip from another video we've already talked about before. It's a conversation he's having with Mike Tyson. And in the previous clip, I think we talked about slavery in the Bible. And in this particular clip, Mike Tyson asks Bill Maher essentially about believing in Jesus. And Bill Maher says, I certainly don't believe in Jesus. And he gives his reasons. And one of those reasons is that essentially the Jesus sort of story is borrowed from ancient myths. And so for whatever reason, that means it can't be true. So let's hear from Bill Maher in terms of his objection.
even the Jesus story, his biography, is completely unoriginal. All the gods that came before him had like the same birthday.
And the same
Ma-
story though as
The
well.
same story, the same, yes, disciples, like 12 people. Many of them were
The
crucified on
Sumerians had
some
the
sort of.
same Jesus effect.
Yeah, they
somebody-
took
yeah.
the stories that were going around the Mediterranean at the time, and they grafted it onto the life of Jesus. I mean, the reason why his birthday is December 25th is because that was
the shortest day of the year. You were telling me something.
yes, right, because that was the day that the sun started to when days started to get longer again, so that the people in the pagan times celebrated that day because it meant that we're going to live again, because the days kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
Now, Tyson goes on to ask a question: why is Jesus so embedded in our psyches publicly and collectively? And Maher goes on to answer that. Now, there's a whole lot in that clip that we're going to address and tackle today, because much of it is based on essentially very, very shoddy scholarship. Now, before I begin to get into the details of this, I do want to give out a shout of thanks to my colleague, Derek Caldwell, who is a researcher and content creator with Embrace the Truth. Much of the information that I'm going to be giving you comes from my own notes and research into these things, but Derek has really fundamentally and importantly helped with the additional research, especially in terms of the sort of new stuff that is out there that really is old stuff just warmed over and repackaged, but he's helped me to quite a bit in this particular episode. So my thanks goes out to Derek. And by the way, like all these episodes now, we're going to have a deliberation on this, where you, the jury, get to deliberate with us on the content of this episode. So Derek will join me for that. So it'll be a fun time where you can ask questions about the content of this episode, or pretty much anything else you want, when we come on live for deliberations 1 week after this episode airs. But let's get into some of the issues here about this idea that this whole Jesus story is unoriginal. I want to back up just for a moment, though, and point out something. That is not a reason to believe that the story is false. Just because it's not original doesn't mean it's false. That's a logical non sequitur. There's no reason to believe that unoriginality of a story means that the story itself isn't true. You have to give independent reasons why it's not true. Just because it looks like something else doesn't mean it's not true. It could be true and look like something else. That's perfectly plausible. I'm going to give you an example of that later on in just a few minutes as we have a conversation. But I want you to notice the logical flaw is that objection wouldn't even be allowed in a court of law. Essentially, I don't think it would be, because there's no relevance to any of those facts. If it were the case that the Jesus story is somehow parallel in significant ways with other stories, and therefore it is, quote, unoriginal, doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. You have to actually base the truth of that story on its independent evidence, not on whether it looks like something else. So hopefully you can see that that's not even logically necessarily the case. So the objection itself already fails because it doesn't have any logical merit to it. But let's start with the premise of this objection in the first place, where it really started. So it was based on the late 19th and early 20th century history of religion school at the University of Göttingen in Germany. They approached Judaism and Christianity usually primarily as historical constructions, that these weren't actually historical events or stories based on reality, but they're historical constructions that people put together to sort of give meaning to their lives. And in so doing, they started seeing parallels between these sort of social constructions of Christianity and Judaism and other social constructions of religion, like the Egyptian and Babylonian and Greek or Hellenistic religious systems. What quickly became apparent, and why it was largely abandoned, was that it was really based on sloppy and shoddy scholarship without any real attention to detail or nuance. They found broad ideas that were somewhat similar and then started to say, well, these are very similar, or there are really great parallels here. The reality was that as people began to look at the Göttingen school in terms of this thought, people began to say, hey, wait a minute, this idea sounds plausible, but the more we look at it, there are no real great parallels. And if there are any that do exist, there's no real causal connection, temporally speaking, between the Christian message or the message of the New Testament and these pagan religious systems. And so that idea lay dormant for a long time. In fact, decades and decades and decades, until it sort of had a resurgence and a popularity increase in the aftermath of a movie or a series of movies actually called Zeitgeist. Now, these were a series of, I think, 3 documentaries between 2007 and 2011. And essentially, the Zeitgeist movies are movies that are conspiracy theory based. They come off as real history, but there's no real history to any of them. And I would even dare say no real or substantive scholarship that would give merit to any of their claims. They're based on conspiracy theories. So I'll give you an example. They allege that Jesus was based on ancient myths. Their other documentaries allege that the September 11th attacks were orchestrated or in some way allowed to happen by the United States government in order to support a fake war on terror and then be able to restrict liberties. And, they have another documentary where there are only a few rich bankers in the world, sort of an Illuminati thing, and they run the world. And that North American countries are conspiring to create a single world government, and that leaders are plotting to implant everyone with microchips and these kind of things. So this is the kind of thing that the Zeitgeist movies say and express. And one of those, of course, is this idea that Jesus is a conglomeration of, the story of Jesus is a conglomeration of other pagan myths or ideas that people tend to believe about their various gods, and it's just a Christianized version of that. But the reality is that the professional academic scholarship in the field of ancient history has either ignored this completely or disagrees with it when they do touch it. And the reason they don't touch it is not because it's sacrosanct and they can't touch it. These are people who have no reason to support Christianity as a historical account of what happened to Jesus. No, they don't touch it because it's not worth their time. It's just something they don't actually consider with any real seriousness anymore. And so they ignore it because it's just not worth their time. But those who have, in fact, dealt with it, disagree with it fundamentally. Now, an ancient historian, John Dixon, who is a Christian, he has even offered to eat a page of his Bible if someone could show him one full professor of ancient history, classics, or New Testament in an accredited university who thinks that this is really true. And so far, John Dixon has had a page out of the Bible free diet. He's never had to do this. So it persists, however, because the Jesus myth and conglomeration of it, it exists largely on the fringe, but it's got like that conspiracy theory level attraction to it. So it's on popular level blogs that have no real editorial or academic oversight, and it has nothing really meaty to it, but people persist in believing it. And Derek was sharing with me this story, and he was talking about one time he was debating a Jesus mythicist online about the historical Jesus, and he asked him, this mythicist, why he persisted in believing Jesus was a myth after hearing Derek's arguments and seeing the evidence, some of which the guy had already known about. Why he still believed it, why he still persisted in believing that he was a myth. And Derek basically said, why, when all the evidence points in the other direction, do you still cling to this belief that Jesus was not a real person? I understand, he said, if you don't believe that what the Bible says about Jesus or that there is a God, but believing that Jesus is not real at all flies in the face of all the historical evidence. And the guy responded back and said, I have a feeling in the next few years, more evidence will become available showing he was not real. Now, friends, you can already see it. Christians get chided all the time for God did it, we don't need to explain it through science kind of view, like a God of the gaps. There's gaps in our knowledge, you just plug God into the gaps, and therefore you're satisfied that you've answered the question. This is really a form of skepticism of the gaps. I'm waiting for proof to show that he didn't exist, even though all the current proof shows that he did. In fact, this is worse than God of the gaps because, and by the way, I don't know anybody who actually, I'm sure there are people who have a God of the gaps, but I don't know any Christians who actually act like, I don't know how things are explained by science, so I'm not even going to go there. We can just plug God into the gaps and not even get there. I don't know any Christians who think that way. But this guy that Derek was interacting with, he says, I have a feeling in the next few years, more evidence will become available showing that Jesus was not real. he's saying that in light of evidence that shows that he is. So there's not even a gap. There's evidence that shows that Jesus is not only a real person, but there's good reasons to believe that the biblical record of his life is quite accurate. So he's not even having a skepticism of the gaps. He's having a skepticism that flies directly in the face of all the evidence. He is a salmon swimming upstream. In fact, I would even say, if you would allow me to do it, he's a salmon swimming up a waterfall. Anyway, I think that that's an important thing that we have to discuss here, because this is why I think it holds on to its allure, this idea that Jesus is either not real or he is a amalgamation of parallels with other ancient religions. Now, I said I'd get to this, by the way, and I want to give you an example of a time when you can have something be parallel to something else. In other words, the story isn't original, as Bill Maher said. I don't believe in Jesus, at least in part because the story isn't all that original. It borrows from all these pagan myths, and he goes to give alleged details of their parallelism. We're going to see in a moment that those details aren't actually parallel in any way, shape, or form, but be that as it may, put that on a shelf for a moment. I pointed out that just because something is unoriginal or has parallels to something else doesn't mean it's untrue. You have to go on the evidence of the actual event itself, not on whether it parallels something that isn't true, okay? The logical reality of how evidence works is you don't draw parallels and say, oh, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this must be false because it looks like this thing we know to be false. Maybe the thing's actually true. What is the evidence for its truth? You can't just dismiss it and wave your hand at it and say, it looks like something false. Here's an example of exactly when that's happened. And you may have heard this before. Morgan Robertson wrote a book in 1898. 1898. It was called The Wreck of the Titan. Now, it was a story about a ship that was called Unsinkable. It was named the Titan. It was an unsinkable ship, the dimensions of which are almost identical to the Titanic's. And like the Titanic, the actual ship that really existed in history, the Titan hit an iceberg in April. And it's nearly in the same location in the North Atlantic that the actual Titanic hit the iceberg. Both had thousands of passengers, but only a few lifeboats. In other words, the lifeboats were way insufficient to support any kind of efforts to rescue the passengers that were on board. The Titan, the fictional ship. And that led to the deaths of many, many people. In fact, some of the names in the novel, The Wreck of the Titan, are very similar to the people who were actually on the actual real Titanic. Now, here is my point, ladies and gentlemen. Robertson wrote his book, The Wreck of the Titan, in 1898, and it has all these eerie, similar parallels to the actual wreck of the Titanic, which happened. Here's why that's important. Despite all of these parallels, these uncanny parallels, one might be tempted to argue that Robertson wrote his book, The Wreck of the Titan, with so many eerily similar factual parallels after the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic. But that's not what happened. Robertson wrote his book, The Wreck of the Titan, with all of those eerie parallels 14 years before the Titanic sank. The Titanic sank in 1912, and Robertson published his book in 1898. Despite those parallels, would one with a straight face actually argue that just because the Titanic story was unoriginal, that it's not historical? No one in their right mind would ever doubt that the Titanic did not actually sink in April of 1912, and that it had fewer lifeboats, far fewer lifeboats, than could support the people on the ship, that it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic in almost the exact same place, that it was called Unsinkable, and that some of the names were parallel. No one would ever deny that as history just because it's quote-unquote unoriginal, just because some guy created a fictitious story. The point is, you shouldn't conclude that earlier fictional stories somehow invalidate later historical events. That would be absurd. But what's interesting is we don't even have that. So even if there were parallels between Christianity and ancient pagan myths and religions, there's no reason for us to doubt the Christian story based on the merit of the actual evidence for the Christian story. So parallels don't mean untrue. But now the question is this: are there actually similarities? Now, I'm going to tell you, there are a lot of things we could go into. And we're going to go into quite a few details, but there's a lot of details we could go into here. Time sort of prohibits that. You could write an entire book on the lack of parallels between the Jesus story and some of the sort of dying and rising god myths. There's Osiris, of course. There's Mithra, and there's others as well. So oftentimes people say there's these parallels, but there really aren't any similarities at all when it comes down to it. So let me give you an example of just how bad sort of the argumentation actually is with regard to this. So we're going to play a clip from someone who's objecting to this idea of the historical nature of the Christian faith, and they're basically going to draw some parallels here. And what you're going to notice is that the length to which people want to draw parallels between Jesus as the Son of God and other religions having sons of God is that they're trying to draw a parallel between the idea that Jesus is the Son of God and other religions having sun gods. That's how bad it gets. But let's listen. Don't take my word for it. Let's listen.
In ancient mythology, we find this whole strain of thought called solar mythology. Many gods start taking on solar attributes because as agricultural communities become more important, the sun becomes a big focus. The most obvious reasons of planting and harvesting. The sun is then personified. So now we have a male sun god. It becomes a religion in many parts of the world. Christianity usurped a tremendous amount of sun worship. Some of us are saying that this was a sun god turned into a Jewish man.
I want to pause for a moment there because if you're just listening to this on the podcast, the audio version, you won't have seen the video that accompanies this. And in the video that accompanies this, what they've done is they've, this idea of the sun god, they have a graphic where it shows a depiction of Apollo, and over it, it says Son of God, but the sun is not spelled S-O-N, it's spelled S-U-N. So this is the level to which people will say, hey, these are the parallels. But you can see automatically that Apollo being a sun god is not the same thing as Jesus being the S-O-N, Son of God. The parallels don't even exist. And in fact, in one sense, it's sort of laughable in this instance. But then, of course, there is this idea that there's a parallel to Jesus's birth on December 25th and the birth of these pagan gods or these mythical gods of the Greeks or of Egypt or whatever it might be. Here's another clip from that same video.
This December 25th birthday was, in fact, the winter solstice. This is really, in fact, the birth of the god of light. December 25th actually is the end of a 3-day period of when the sun stands still. The sun appears to be dying as the days become shorter, and the sun is reborn at that point.
There's a lot to be said about that. There's a couple of things in response that I think are worth mentioning here. First and foremost, if you're even remotely biblically literate, the first thing you'll notice is that the Bible never says Jesus was born on December 25th. Now, the earliest recognized date we see is actually January 6th in some ancient Christian literature and ancient Christian sources. But most scholars would say that maybe Jesus was born somewhere around August. Who knows? But the point is, the Bible, and it wasn't the case in Christianity for the longest time, that December 25th was recognized as the actual date of his birth. Now, some might say, look, what ends up happening is that Christians don't know the actual date of his birth, and they didn't know the actual date of his birth. And so in order to make the message palatable, the historical reality palatable to pagans who did center their worship around winter and summer solstices, that the date was placed around December 25th or December 22nd, whenever the solstice would occur, so that it would be a way to convey the Christian message to pagans. It doesn't mean that the Christian message of the birth of Jesus on December 25th is somehow a sacrosanct date, that it must have happened on that date, and that they really just borrowed other mythologies or solstice worship or whatever it might be. Rather, what they were doing, they weren't borrowing from it. They were actually using it to convey a truth that they said was actually historical. But you'll also notice something. There's some pretty muddy thinking in this clip. She's conflating Christmas and Easter. She says the incarnation is based on the winter solstice, the incarnation of God in the flesh, Jesus' birth. but that it is the dying and rising over 3 days part, the whole Easter part, which has never been associated with December, but with springtime and the Passover. It's not even having to do with the summer solstice at all, or the winter solstice. It has to do with springtime and the Passover itself. So this is interesting all by itself in that the wordplay that's going on here, where in the video, if you're listening to the podcast, you didn't see the video, but if you're watching on YouTube, you did see it, where the idea of a sun god or son of God, S-U-N, and that wordplay with son of God, S-O-N, that might work out in English as a nice bit of wordplay or pun, but doesn't work in Greek really. To properly translate the lack of wordplay in English, you have to say something like the son of God versus like the salon of God. Son of God has some of the same letters as salon of God, but no one would ever say that salon, S-A-L-O-N, is similar in any way to Son of God, S-O-N. It has some of the same letters. In fact, most of the same letters, but no one expects that to be the same concept. In Greek and in English, it would be something like this. The sun in Greek is Helios, H-E-L-I-O-S. Sun, S-O-N in Greek, is Huios, U-I-O-S. They're not the same word. They might sound somewhat similar, but in no way was there any idea of paralleling these two concepts. It just doesn't work. And just as a total aside too, Christianity is actually rooted in the Hebrew religion, which would have considered sun worship of any kind, especially considering that they have the entire story of leaving Egypt that did worship a sun god. They would have considered any worship of the sun in any way, shape, or form to be idolatrous and blasphemous, and worshiping created things instead of the creator. And look at Romans 1, verse 25. So there isn't an actual link historically, and there's not even a theoretical link in terms of the ideas being conveyed as well. Now, the mythicists go on to say something like Jesus's life or parts of his life are based on myths. So, for example, a dying and rising god like Osiris. Now, according to T&D Mettinger, who is no slouch, by the way, a former professor at Lund University, a member of the Royal Academy of Letters, History and Antiquities of Stockholm, and he's researched this topic extensively. So there are a few scholars who've actually decided to look at this and basically said we can now ignore it. There's no evidence of truly dying and rising gods predating Christianity, nor is there any evidence that these dying and rising gods did so in any way vicariously for the sins of others. In other words, there's no theological significance to any dying and rising gods. In Christianity, the whole reason Jesus dies is to pay for human sin, and he rises to show his victory over death, which is the consequence of human sin. In no sense do we have dying and rising gods predating Christianity, and in no sense do we have dying and rising gods who have any of this kind of theological significance. And Jesus' death had uniquely theological significance, and it was rooted essentially in the Jewish observation of the Passover. When death is tied to the Passover, but God's Spirit passes over people, the Hebrew people, who were in Egypt and in judgment of the Egyptians, but God's Spirit, or the spirit of death, passes over the Jewish homes because they've killed an animal, a lamb, and they've spread its blood on the lintels and the posts of the doors. That is symbolic of what is to come with the Messiah, that the Messiah's blood was to be shed. And when that blood is shed, and those who accept and hide under the protection of that blood is a payment for the sins that rightfully cause us to deserve death. And so that blood being shed provides protection and rescue from the consequences. The only parallels to be drawn here are not between the New Testament and pagan religions, but the New Testament and the Old Testament. And that is quite telling. Now, there are actually non-parallels. And let's just go through these in some detail here just for a moment. Osiris was murdered by his brother. Yes, he died as a matter of betrayal, but he was murdered by his brother, Set, and he was chopped into 14 pieces and scattered about the earth. Now, the goddess Isis, Osiris's wife and his sister, put 13 of the pieces, not all of them, but put 13 of the pieces back together and buried him. And some say that she dipped the pieces in the river Styx or whatever. The point is that the accounts are very different depending on when you happen to read them. There is no uniform account of what happened with the legendary god Osiris. And she used Osiris to conceive her son Horus. He then becomes the god of the underworld. He never rises back to the land of the living. He's better considered more like a mummy or a zombie, if anything at all, for he's never really truly alive again. And he certainly isn't in any way glorified or whole. Now, many meanings were actually attributed to Osiris's death over the centuries, not one of which, is the vicarious suffering for sin and redemption of humanity. Osiris's death and his, by the way, staying dead as the god of the underworld has nothing to do with the vicarious suffering for sin or the redemption of humanity in any way. The meanings could so often change, in fact, for the Osiris legend, that you'd see these traditions not really set in any texts about Osiris at all. Now, him rising or not rising, but him coming back in a sense as the god of the underworld has a lot to do with the way in which the Egyptians saw the afterlife, which was not parallel in any way to how Christians see the afterlife. Bruce Metzger explains it, and he says, it was the pious desire of devotees to be buried in the same ground where, according to the local tradition, not the standard tradition, but the local tradition of their towns, with the body of Osiris. In other words, people who followed the idea of Osiris wanted to be buried where they thought he was buried and was still lying. No one thought, and here's the kicker, no one thought that Osiris had come back to life. That's the important point to take away from Metzger. So if these people who had these local traditions, Osiris is buried there, wanted their bodies buried in that same spot, it presupposes something, that they didn't think Osiris rose from the dead, that his body is still there. Edwin Yamauchi also talks about this, and he says that the Egyptian afterlife was only accessed. You could only actually gain entrance into the afterlife if three conditions were met: mummification, nourishment through food left for the deceased, or magical depictions of food on the wall, and through burying magical texts with the deceased. So you see that nothing at all has to do with Osiris dying for their sins or rising in victory over death. Entry into the afterlife has nothing to do with Osiris's death. In fact, it has nothing to do with Osiris at all. And everything about entering into the afterlife in whatever condition has to do with Jesus, his person, his work on the cross, his death there, and his resurrection. So you automatically see there's no factual parallels of any note, and there's no theological parallels of any note between Jesus and Osiris. In fact, Henri Frankfurt, an Egyptologist, says this basically: Osiris, in fact, was not a dying god at all, but a dead god. He never returned among the living. He was not liberated from the underworld of the dead. On the contrary, Osiris altogether belonged to the world of the dead. It was from there that he bestowed his blessings upon Egypt. He was always depicted as a mummy, a dead king. And the various theologians over time, whether it's Origen of Alexandria or others, have pointed out there are really no parallels here whatsoever. Now, there are those who say, okay, maybe not Osiris, maybe Mithra, sort of this is a pagan mystery religion or cult called Mithraism that believes in this idea possibly of a god who dies in some way and then blesses the world. And so they try to draw parallels with Mithra. So Mithraism began as essentially an offshoot of a much older religion called Zoroastrianism. And we'll get to that in a minute, because that's where actually I think the nuanced response or the rehash of the asked and answered comes in with Zoroastrianism. But we'll get there in a minute. Now, Ronald Nash points out that Mithraism didn't even have any influence, nor was it even known by anybody in the first century Roman world. They just didn't know about it in the first century Roman world. And of course, that includes Judea, which was a Roman province in the first century. So the very place where Jesus was born, lived, died, I believe resurrected, and the birth of Christianity itself in the first century has no real knowledge of or any influence by Mithraism. Instead, all evidence points to the 2nd century as the establishment of Mithraism in the Roman world. In other words, based on the historical record we have right now, it's unlikely that Mithraism, which became established in the Roman world in the 2nd century, had any influence, it couldn't possibly have any influence chronologically, on Christianity, which began well before Mithraism even took root in the same world where Christianity was born. And so you'd have someone like Nash saying that Mithraism could not have possibly influenced early Christianity. And again, Yamauchi would agree on the same score. For example, a lot of the skeptics would say that Mithra was born just like Jesus through a virgin. And so there's a parallel right there, among others. And he was born on December 25th through a virgin. But was he? Is that what the documents actually say? Is that what the sort of mystery religion of Mithraism actually says? No, there's no parallel. Mithra was not born of a virgin. He was born from a rock. Was Mithra born in a cave on December 25th? Well, who knows, according to that legend. But the Bible does not state that Jesus was born in a cave, although this was, was part of an early tradition backing up to in Eastern Orthodoxy into the late 2nd century, but it's certainly not a 1st century idea. And the Bible does not state, like I said before, that Jesus was born on December 25th. Did Mithra actually have 12 disciples? Well, that's another parallel, by the way. It said, he was born of a virgin. He was born on December 25th. He had 12 disciples. We've already seen he's not born of a virgin. We've already seen that the December 25th parallel doesn't even exist. And did he have 12 disciples? Well, Mithra is never described as having 12 disciples. He's depicted in murals with 12 signs of the zodiac, but nothing like 12 disciples. And Jesus' 12 disciples came from earlier Jewish symbolism of the sons of Israel or the tribes of Israel. It had nothing to do with the zodiac or astrology. So this is pretty bad, because any attempt to say that Mithra had 12 disciples is essentially made up out of whole cloth. You see the number 12 in the Mithra story because of the signs of the zodiac, because there are 12 months. And then you see the number 12 in the Jesus story, and you think there must be parallels. Well, there's not parallels, nothing of substance. Jesus' disciples are completely and utterly different than and utterly independent of anything having to do with the zodiac. So there's no parallel there either. The mythicists might say that eternal life was gained through Mithra's sacrifice, just like Jesus' sacrifice were to gain eternal life for his devotees and his followers. But Mithra didn't sacrifice his own life. Mithra sacrificed a bull, not himself. And the only evidence of this idea of him sacrificing a bull, not himself, leading to eternal life is dated after AD 375. So just to put that in perfect context here, that the only idea that Mithra sacrificed a bull and that had anything to do with the salvation of his devotees comes 300 years after the birth of Christianity. So it may be that Mithraism, in one sense, is older than Christianity, but this idea of a sacrifice having anything to do with salvation is far after Christianity. And so it's highly likely that if anybody influenced anybody, it wasn't that Mithraism influenced Christianity, it's that Christianity's truths influenced the Mithraic legends. Another parallel that mythicists might make is that Mithra was resurrected, and that somehow has some kind of salvific effect. But we've already seen he didn't even die for the sins of his followers. Therefore, he wouldn't have resurrected for the sins of his followers. We have very little information historically on the death of Mithra in terms of what what the people who believed in Mithraism would have believed about his death. And so if we have no information about his death, we have no information or evidence of any sort of resurrection at all. So that parallel goes away. In fact, there's a real serious difficulty in any Mithraic texts. Ronald Nash, again, he points out that attempts to reconstruct the beliefs and practices of Mithraism face enormous challenges because of the scanty information that has survived, much of which only enters the historical record far after Christ's time. So I would object, if anybody tried to bring this evidence, I'd say objection, lack of foundation. You haven't actually established that the claim you're making has any historical warrant whatsoever. There's so little information that you can't possibly meet the burden of proof. And let's say the burden of proof is just even more likely than not. You might recall from season 1, we discussed burdens of proof. And in a court of law, you'd have a burden of proof like more likely than not. If it's like 51% to 49% likely that this person did this thing, then you'd find in favor of the other party or something like that. There's also preponderance of the evidence, which is what I just kind of described. Then you have clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher standard to have to meet. And then you have beyond reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard to meet. Well, given the complete lack of information we have about early Mithraism, and that what information we do have flies against the idea of any parallels, saying there's a parallel not only flows against the historical stream of what we do have, there's almost no evidence whatsoever about early Mithraism for us to establish any claim at all. You can't claim something's parallel when you don't even know what that something actually is. Stanley Porter and Stephen Bedard wrote that the timing and the development of the various features of Mithraism suggest that rather than Christianity being influenced by it, the mystery religion of Mithraism was influenced by Christianity. And this is not actually all that surprising, given that what we do know of Mithraism is that it's a very syncretistic religion. It tends to absorb the ideas and the myths of the religions around it. And so we would expect there to be parallels, at least in some respect, between Mithraism and Christianity, if Mithraism took Christian ideas and then adopted it to itself because of its syncretistic nature. In other words, it wouldn't bother a Mithraism or a Mithraist that there are parallels between Christianity and Mithra because they're okay with that, because they would regularly co-opt these various ideas into their systems of belief. So we don't have Osiris. We don't have Mithra. Let's talk about Horus now. Is there a parallel between Jesus and his life and that of Horus? And I think we're going to find out pretty quickly that there are not. And by the way, Porter and Bedard, who I already mentioned, they have some really great responses to this kind of stuff as well. And they engage with some of the most recent sort of iterations of this idea that Jesus is a facsimile of Horus. But the reality is Porter and Bedard point out that this stuff is just bunk. And let's give you a couple of reasons why that's the case, which shows you that there's no real academic or scholarly rigor behind any of these ideas of the parallels. Was Horus born of the virgin Isis? Remember what we said before. Horus was not born of a virgin, but from the sexual union between Osiris, who we already talked about, and Isis. Though, Osiris was dead at the time, which is not only weird, but gross. But Horus is still the son created from the sexual union of Osiris and Isis. So that's not anything like a parallel with Jesus being born of a virgin. Some might say, oh, well, Horus was hunted by Herut, just like Jesus was opposed by Herod. And that somehow shows that there's a corresponding parallel there. Now, the fact of the matter is, no one really doubts the existence of Herod as an actual person. He was a real historical person from the time frame within which the Gospels were written. And he's hardly an added mythological element to Jesus' story. Everyone knows Herod existed. No one really doubts this of any repute. Herod's existence is not only attested to in the New Testament, but his existence is attested to outside of the New Testament from multiple sources, including by his friend, the Jewish historian Nicholas of Damascus, and by Flavius Josephus. There is no Herut in the primary texts of the Horus story. That's later on a development. So the alleged Herod-Herut parallel doesn't even exist. Another claimed parallel between Jesus and Horus is that the three magi who visited Jesus correspond to the three Egyptian solar deities. First of all, that's quite a leap. Just because three people exist in this story and three people or three deities exist in this story means that there's some kind of a parallel. That by itself is already tenuous at best. But what's more important is that the Bible does not actually say that there were three magi. It says that the magi, however many there were, brought three types of gifts to Jesus when he was born: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. There could have been dozens. There could have been two. Who knows? But they came, and the reason why we depict 3 in our nativity scenes is not because we know there were 3, it's because there were 3 gifts. And so in order to have a set that you can put out on your lawn or on your table, you'd have to have 3 guys holding 3 different gifts. That's it. So there's no parallel there either. It's just a spurious parallel. Was Horus crucified between 2 thieves, and was he buried in the tomb? Now, people often say this is also part of the Horus story. And this parallels the story of Jesus, of course. The reality is there's very little evidence of this in any of the sources. Again, Porter and Bedard say this: while there are some similarities to the death of Jesus, like a person dies and a mother grieves, and with a little imagination, they say, there is some similarity between being pierced by a scorpion, which is how Horus died, and being pierced by nails. On the whole, the stories are radically different. In other words, if the best you can do is that Horus dies and Jesus dies, that Horus was stung by a scorpion and Jesus was pierced by nails, if that's the best you can do, then there's really a terrible reason to think that there's any real parallels at all. By the way, also, this is important to note too, is that in the versions which describe Horus dying, all the texts or the stories are that he dies when he's a child. It's not sacrificial. He doesn't die for any theological purpose, and he does nothing to offer us eternal salvation. His death is essentially meaningless. There's no mention at all of 2 thieves dying alongside Horus. Porter and Bedard could find nothing, and in fact, it seems like there is no source that says that there are thieves who die next to Horus, just like there were thieves who died next to Jesus. Now, that's just fabrication out of whole cloth, which tends to show you just how incredible this whole endeavor actually is. So the next question then becomes, was Horus resurrected, as Jesus was said to have resurrected? Now, Horus is awakened from death by the god Thoth after his mother, Isis, prays for him. That's not the same thing in any way, shape, or form to what happened to Jesus. Thoth used spells to raise Horus from the dead. Thoth, who was not Horus's father, did not raise him by his own power. Horus is not raised to life to redeem the dead. He's not raised to life to show his victory over death so that we, his followers or whatever, have to, can live in victory over death and the consequences of sin. Nothing like that is happening at all. Mary Jo Sharp points out that the point was that worshipers of Isis would have their children protected by the goddess. In other words, Isis's praying and Thoth raising Horus from the dead is a reason for the Egyptian worshipers or the worshipers of Isis, Horus, and Thoth to believe that Isis could protect their children. That's the point. There's nothing there salvific at all. So to sum up this part is that the way this objection has been asked and answered is to show that there are no parallels between these other mystery religions, whether it's Osiris or Horus or Mithra, and the Jesus story. There's just no parallels of any note. And even where there might be some parallels, we've already seen that just because a factual account has parallels to a fictional account doesn't mean that the factual account is now fictional. You have to look at the actual evidence in the favor of the factual account. So in order to address this issue and keep asking the question over and over again, like a good lawyer, we have to change it up a little bit. So what they did, the mythicists would do, is say, okay, we're not going to bring up the Horus, Mithra, Osiris stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to change tactics a little bit and walk back all these alleged parallels. And what we're going to do instead is maybe rely on Zoroastrianism. But before we do that, I want you to notice something. Now, in the law, there's a thing called party admissions, or also statements against interest. In other words, things that would normally be considered excludable hearsay in a court of law get admitted into a trial because they're either said by a party and they're an admission of that party, or they're a statement that actually goes against that party's position or that witness's position, which is called a statement against interest. And those are brought in because they're more likely to be true and reliable because the person wouldn't say things that hurts their position and be lying about it. So we see that a little bit here. I want to play for you some clips of some folks who actually would admit that the so-called parallels really don't exist after all. So let's hear a party admission, essentially, of someone who's walking back and conceding that maybe the parallels people once thought aren't actually there. Now, to be fair, I'm going to play a clip from a video from the A Theologica YouTube page, and Derek Bennett is speaking, and they are making the point. They are trying to make the point that Jesus is parallel to Osiris in some ways, but you're going to see that they're actually conceding that there are no real substantive parallels to speak of. Here they are.
The similarities may only be analogical, that is, coincidental, though they remain classifiable in terms of phenomena. They are both alike religious expressions of the hope for life after death, especially as embodied in a divinity.
So what he's basically saying is that there are some parallels in terms of concept, and they're categorizable, but they're concepts. They're not actually anything to do with specifics. Because the case sounded impressive when it seemed so specific. Like he had 12 disciples, and he was born on December 25th, and he was born of a virgin, and he dies with thieves around him, and just like these other gods did. But then they're starting to concede, look, they're analogical parallels, if any, and they center around these themes of redemption after death. So we're seeing that there's some concession that the case isn't all that strong. There's just the concepts might be parallel. But again, parallel doesn't mean that one's not true. But one way in order to try to keep the parallelomania alive is to, instead of saying that there are direct historical parallels, which suggests that the Jesus myth, as it were, is untrue, is that there are some new age ways of actually explaining this and saying, hey, take a syncretistic look at this, is that there might not be these parallels, but maybe we're just all, seeking after the same thing and the same end goal of a redemption of some kind and a spiritual awakening of some kind. And so we should expect there to be a similar story across different cultures that have very similar ideas and themes, and they're all true. They're all equally true. So listen to this clip.
Over a span of thousands of years, similar accounts can be found throughout the ancient world that tell of a savior, born of parents who have come from both heaven and earth, who lived as a divine being, died in an act of betrayal, and was risen to new life. These similarities make a compelling case towards two possibilities. Either A, the same story was told from generation to generation, and then cultural aspects were added to make the story more fitting to the prospective religion it was practiced in, or B, different saviors have existed throughout history in many cultures who share a common story and possibly a common creator.
So they want to go, the people in this video, in this clip, want to go with the second option, that these stories are all sort of stories about different saviors who were real saviors but had a common creator. So they'd say that Jesus and Krishna are so parallel, or that other savior figures in other systems like Mithraism or whatever are all creations of the common creator. But what I want to point out, though, is we've already pointed out that the alleged parallels that even this video says happened or are convincing evidence of something didn't really happen because they're not evidence of anything, because they're not actually evidence. But let's focus now on the sort of most recent iteration of Christianity is a borrowing of other religions and therefore isn't true. Again, remember the logic is that just because there's parallels doesn't mean that one of them isn't true. They could either both be false or one of them could be true. And the accusation essentially comes from the idea of Zoroastrianism, is that Zoroastrianism is a belief system essentially propagated by a guy named Zoroaster. It was in the Persian era and the Persian area, Iran, modern-day Iran, and that the idea here, and Britannica.com actually says this, which is interesting because it gives you no sources whatsoever to back this up. But listen to what it says. This is from Britannica.com. It is likely that Zoroastrianism, which is a very old religion, by the way, they say it is likely that Zoroastrianism influenced the development of Judaism and the birth of Christianity. The Christians, following a Jewish tradition, identified Zoroaster with Ezekiel, Nimrod, Seth, Balaam, and Baruch, and even through the latter with Jesus Christ himself. And again, I had to point this out because it's really important to point it out. No references whatsoever to back any of this up. One example of a possible source to do this with comes from a source called Pseudo-Clement. It was ascribed to Clement of Rome, but it was actually not by him. And though this writing does identify Nimrod with Zoroaster, that's not a good thing. This work is very anti-Persian. In other words, this pseudo-Clement is anti-Persian religion. As can be seen in this case, they point out that Nimrod was associated with Assyria and Mesopotamia and with being the leader of the people who built the Tower of Babel. This is definitely not a sign of Zoroaster influencing Christianity. It's quite the opposite. Zoroaster was often tied to magic, perhaps even being the arch magician, the creator of magic. Nothing that Jews or Christians would have legitimately used as a foundation or a counterpart to Jesus exists in the life of Zoroaster. But still, Zoroastrianism is now touted as sort of the coup de grace to the originality of the Christian faith. Now, Zoroastrianism is a very old religion, but very little can be known of its earliest beliefs. And Yamauchi, it's a good example. Edwin Yamauchi talks about the sort of inability to know the deepest and most certifiable things about the earliest beliefs of the Zoroastrians. Yamauchi says that in order to believe in a link between Judaism and Zoroastrianism, you have to presuppose, not establish, because there's no evidence to establish it, but you have to presuppose the chronological priority of the Iranian beliefs, late dates for the Old Testament texts, a close parallelism between the beliefs, and reasons for dependence. And these claims have no actual evidence for them. So I would object if someone said it, lack of foundation. You didn't actually establish in any way, shape, or form that there was a chronological difference, that there was any kind of interdependence, or that the texts of the Old Testament so far were late dated to the texts of the Zoroastrian belief that there's any link whatsoever. There simply is no foundation. Another thing that's important to point out is that Zoroaster is the prophet of Zoroastrianism. He is not the Zoroastrian god. That god is Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. It's not Zoroaster. So equating Zoroaster with Jesus doesn't make any sense because Jesus is the incarnation of God. Zoroaster has no claim to being the incarnation of any kind of deity whatsoever. So that parallel is a fundamental non-parallel. An important aspect here is that we can't really know much about early Zoroastrianism. As Yamauchi points out, the Zoroastrian texts are rather disparate and, with one exception, the Gathas, relatively late. They are limited and difficult sources to utilize for a reconstruction of the ancient Persian religion. Richard Fry, who is a scholar of Iranian and Central Asian studies and was the Aga Khan Professor Emeritus of Iranian Studies at Harvard, he compares an Iranologist's task of piecing together Zoroastrianism to a situation where a student of Judaism has only the Psalms, fragments of the Talmud, and later writings as sources for reconstructing the history of ancient Jewish religion. In other words, you can construct part of Zoroastrianism, ancient Zoroastrianism, but you really can't construct the whole picture because you only have fragmentary bits of evidence in order to do that. Furthermore, there's no real parallels in theology with Zoroastrianism and Christianity. So the idea that Zoroastrianism was a monotheism early on, it was most likely not taught by Zoroaster. Instead, Zoroastrianism taught either henotheism or dualism. In fact, Mary Boyce, who is an expert on Zoroastrianism, explains that Zoroastrian monotheism is difficult to affirm because, in her words, quote, the character of every known old Iranian religion appears polytheistic, and no declaration of the existence of one God and one God alone can be found in any source, not even in the utterances of Zoroaster himself. So you already have a big issue with the parallels because Hebrew religion and, of course, Christianity by extension were specifically monotheistic. Also, God in Zoroastrianism is not omnipotent. Yamauchi, again, explains it this way: only with the help of men who choose his side will God triumph over the evil one in the end. In other words, God in Zoroastrianism needs the help of men to triumph over the evil one. The biblical God, on the other hand, is totally omnipotent and doesn't need anybody to explain his own existence, nor does he need anybody to defeat anybody. And in fact, he defeats evil for us, not with us. He doesn't need us to defeat evil. In fact, he defeats the evil inside of us. There are no parallels in terms of creation as well. To believe that the Old Testament borrowed from Zoroastrianism in terms of its creation accounts, you have to agree with the very minority understanding of Isaiah 40 to 45 and totally disregard the Genesis account. Zoroastrianism has a fundamental idea about human existence that doesn't include original sin, and that, of course, is important and part and parcel of Christian religion. If one becomes evil in Zoroastrianism, one must use their own will to find salvation. Salvation does not come vicariously through the grace of God by someone paying for your sins and rising from the dead to prove they could do it. In other words, it's a works-based system. Mary Boyce says this: there could be no intervention, whether compassionate or capricious, by an omnipotent being to alter the consequences of people's fates because of their bad sins in Zoroastrianism. There just simply isn't that kind of an idea at all. So we've seen quite a bit of a lack of parallels here. And I could go on and on. There are quite a few more, but time doesn't necessarily permit us to go into every one of these things. In fact, just to cap off the last one in terms of resurrection, Yamauchi points out that in Zoroastrianism, there is no certain affirmation of belief in a resurrection by Zoroaster in the Gathas. In other words, Zoroaster himself, who is not God anyway, doesn't actually rise from the dead. There's no actual way to prove that through even the most sacred text of Zoroastrianism, the Gathas. So it quite seriously appears that there are no parallels of any significant note between Christianity and any of these other religious systems, whether it's the mystery religions of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Mithra, or it's the still existent to this day religion of Zoroastrianism. The parallels just don't exist. And if there are parallels, all the evidence suggests that everything flows against this skeptical challenge, that if there are any parallels, it's because those systems of belief likely borrowed from the Christian message, not the other way around. So I'm going to wrap up by giving you a couple more party admissions, calling to the stand a couple other witnesses who once claimed that there were parallels, but now see the errors in this and are willing to admit it. Let's hear from Todd Gates.
And it turns out that the passages that I was most interested in, those about virgin births and Judgment Day and heaven and hell, were actually written in the post-Christian centuries. Now, the later Zoroastrian scriptures were supposedly based on the earlier ones, the ones that predate Christianity. So it's possible that the New Testament authors really were influenced by Zoroastrianism. But it's also possible, the reverse is possible, that is, Zoroastrian may have been influenced by the New Testament. Or maybe they both influenced each other. Zoroastrianism had ideas.
You can already hear in Mr. Gates's statement that he had looked into these things and he sees, the parallels I thought were there, or at least the level of influence with Zoroastrianism, for example, doesn't really exist to the level that I thought it once did. So let's hear from Todd Gates again in a video called Why Zoroastrianism Might Not Be One of the Religions That Influenced the Bible's Authors. Here he is.
Even though the evidence is solid that Zoroastrianism predates Christianity, we actually have little solid evidence of exactly what Zoroastrian beliefs were in the pre-Christian era, because all the pre-Christian Zoroastrian texts have been lost to history.
Now, this is important. He said that all the pre-Christian Zoroastrian texts have been lost to history. Who knows what they said? We have very little evidence. So he's willing to admit that. Now, this is interesting coming from this guy because Mr. Gates is still a Jesus mythicist, at least based on his most recent videos, and this one wasn't all that recent. The point here is that even someone who doesn't claim to be a Christian is willing to admit that these parallels don't exist is powerful party admissions, or at least some kind of statement against interest that we should pay attention to. So friends, let me conclude with just this thought. And I'm going to quote from C.S. Lewis. And this is what he says on what's called the true myth. That might seem like an oxymoron, but let me explain it by just quoting C.S. Lewis himself. He says, now the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened, and one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth, where the others are men's myths. In other words, the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images as he found there, while Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. Here's what Lewis is trying to point out, is that there may be similar themes where there is a human longing for redemption. There is a human longing to understand how we got here. There is a human longing to understand why the world is the way it is, why the human heart is the way the human heart is. Is there a way out of this mess? That there is a human recognition that sin is so bad that it's tainted the world and certainly tainted our lives, and we can't be the solution because we are the problem. What Lewis is pointing out here is that those truths are universally accepted. And yes, there may be stories in other religious systems that are trying to basically explain a fulfillment for those yearnings, but those yearnings aren't themselves illegitimate, or those ponderings aren't illegitimate. They are legitimate ponderings. And what Lewis is pointing out is that those other myths, though they be false because they're not rooted in history, they're speaking to a true need. And so what God has done is he has entered into history, and he has created the quote-unquote true myth in the sense that he has addressed all of our legitimate ponderings, our needs, our longings, and our hopes in actual history. So the longings might be the same, and the themes may be parallel, but the history is unique, and it's unique in the sense that it actually happened. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want to thank Derek Caldwell once again for putting together a lot of great information. This has been an episode with lots of information, but for whatever reason, this objection persists. I think that at the end of the day, we can conclusively say that this one has been asked and answered, re-asked and re-answered, but the truth remains the same no matter what the question is. So until next time, and until I see you at Deliberations Live where we can interact on this material, this is Abdu Murray for All Rise. The defense rests.